Hey everyone, MeltingMan234 here, and welcome to another Forgotten Media Christmas special, where I dig up some stuff right out of Santa's bag. Yep, it's Christmas again, which means it's time to cover another lesser-known Christmas-themed topic. Looking back at it all, it's kinda crazy that I tried to do 2 Christmas specials every year, but that was quickly short-lived, so now it's just 1 a year, to save me the stress from the holiday season. But this year is going to be a little different because we're going to be looking at 2 Christmas-themed topics in one video. A direct-to-video film, 9 Dog Christmas, and the video game, Daze Before Christmas. First, we'll start off with 9 Dog Christmas, that was released in 2004. It starts off with 2 stray dogs, Tank and Snowplow, trying to survive in life out in the streets. That is, until they get captured by Pierre, a guy who desperately wants to be rich and famous with his traveling dog show. We also get the other stray dogs, who were also captured by Pierre, so here's the basic rundown. QT, the only female in the group where she and Tank form a relationship. Cheech, the stereotypical Hispanic Chihuahua. Chester, the boxer dog who is obsessed with boxing. Fetch, the funny one, I guess. McGregor, the stereotypical Scottish Terrier. No Name, where his only gimmick is being obsessed with going home. And Frenchie, Pierre's assistant. Meanwhile, at the North Pole, Santa and the elves are getting ready for Christmas Day. But it turns out the reindeer have gotten sick and are unable to help out. Even Rudolph is out of commission. So now their lead elf, Buzz, heads out to find replacement reindeer, along with the help of Agnes Ann, a clumsy but well-meaning elf gal. After a couple of scenes of Pierre's new performance going wrong and the elves wandering the town to find replacements, Buzz's glasses break and is unable to see, which then leads to the dogs and the elves crossing paths.
Miss? Ma'am? What's that say?
That says rond, dear.
Reindeer?
Yeah, so that whole misunderstanding is how they plan to have Santa's sleigh being pulled by dogs. And if you're wondering why didn't Agnes read it to him, well, it turns out she doesn't know how to read, despite the fact that there was a previous scene contradicting this. Anyway, they leave behind a note saying that they are borrowing the dogs, much to Pierre's dismay. Even so, he can't be bothered to go looking for more stray dogs to use in his show, and decides to head to the North Pole. In said North Pole, the dogs are put through some flight training to pull Santa's sleigh with some wacky montage stuff, as well as having a nice place to stay warm and be fed. Meanwhile, Pierre and Frenchie make their way to the North Pole, and despite their goofy antics, they are surprisingly successful in kidnapping all the dogs. Though it doesn't quite explain why he's towing them behind with his sleigh. I get that he needed it just to get to the North Pole, but you'd think that driving off in his truck would be faster than letting his assistant do all the work. In fact, whatever happened to that truck anyway? After the elves steal it, it's pretty much gone throughout the whole film. All seems lost now that Buzz is discouraged over this, but Agnes is determined to find them, after spotting Pierre's footprints. Speaking of which, Pierre makes a stop at a mining facility after seeing a sign of selling dogs for cash. The shady odor offers him a double or nothing offer in a game of darts, and Pierre gives in to the gambling deal by throwing in his sleigh and Frenchie too. Frenchie overhears this and decides that he's had enough with his owner, and runs away, which later leads him to meeting Agnes after saving her from a polar bear by accident. Agnes then asks him if he's seen the missing dogs, and at first he doesn't want to go back, but reluctantly decides to help her out anyway, especially if it means getting revenge on his former owner. So they manage to free the dogs from being sold off, chase Pierre off of a cliff, and they pretty much just leave him being stuck on a patch of ice drifting out in the middle of nowhere. They made it back to the workshop just in time to help Santa deliver the toys, but not before they're sprinkled on with some Christmas magic. Well, that's quite the Deus Ex Machina moment. If it's so simple to make ordinary dogs fly using magic dust, then what was the point of the whole training montage? Anyway, Santa is successful in delivering all the gifts to the world, and as he's finishing up his final rounds, he gives each of the dogs new homes. Despite having nothing to pull his sleigh now, the film ends with this random tow truck guy helping him out. Yeah, he's not really an elf or anything, just some random guy who probably thinks that Santa is some random old man who escaped from the retirement home. And that concludes 9 Dog Christmas, and it was very meh. I never saw this film as a kid, so I don't really have any nostalgia for it. And for a film called 9 Dog Christmas, the dogs themselves don't really do much. It's mostly focused on Pierre and the elves. The dogs themselves feel less like the main characters and more like the MacGuffin. Of course, it doesn't help that they're all pretty one-dimensional, like, hey, we have a Scottish Terrier dog, so of course he has to speak in a Scottish accent. There's also some CG that's used, mostly for vehicles, and yeah, it definitely hasn't aged well. Especially when there's one instance when they put the model on the wrong layer, so it looks like the car just comes out of nowhere. There's also a few songs in the film, but honestly, they're not that memorable. It just boils down to the generic work song, the generic love song, and the rest. There are some noticeable voice actors in this special, like Russie Taylor voicing Agnes Ann, even if she's just doing her Webby voice from DuckTales.
2 pigs, a chicken, and a partridge in a pear tree, and roughly 0 reindeer.
And surprisingly, they even got James Earl Jones to be the narrator of this film.
We begin with 2 dogs, the all-time unluckiest, most misfortunate street mutts ever.
Ah, poor James. We still miss ya. But yeah, that's about it for this film. Maybe you'll find some enjoyment if you're a dog lover or something, but it just didn't do much for me. There's no streaming service that has this film, well, as far as I know, but it has been released on VHS and DVD, and they usually go for cheap prices. Even that one DVD bundle that comes with a plush toy of Snowplow, if you really like the guy, I guess. Now let's move on to Daze Before Christmas. This game is kinda interesting. From what I can gather, it was made by Funcom and published by Sunsoft. It was first released in Australia for the Genesis/Mega Drive in 1994, then it got ported to the Super NES for Europe, and this game was going to be released in America, but those plans ended up going nowhere because apparently Sunsoft's USA branch went out of business. So yeah, another one of those games that we Americans never got. The game's story is pretty simple. A bunch of these random assholes show up and decide that they want to ruin Christmas by stealing all the presents, elves, and reindeer. So now it's up to jolly old Saint Nick to defeat these guys, and still make his rounds in time for Christmas Day. So in this game, you play as Santa Claus running around in this platformer, shooting Christmas magic or jumping on enemies, all while making it to the end of the stage. There's presents you can collect from either defeating enemies or opening the ones out in the open that'll either have elves to free, health, extra lives, and most of the time, bombs or enemies. I usually jump on them just because I find that face Santa makes to be so amusing. Well, time to go and save Christmas. Ho ho, holy shit! Aside from that, you also have bells that act as checkpoints, and a power-up that turns you into Anti-Claus. At first I thought it was coffee, but no, apparently it's supposed to be tea. So, milk is good, tea is bad? I don't get it. Anyway, in this form you're invincible, but you don't collect presents when killing enemies, and you can't open presents either. Oh yeah, there's also this one power-up that replaces Santa's magic with fire, but it's rarely used. The levels have some nice variety with its themes, from the inside of festive cabins to the snowy landscapes of the North Pole, as well as dark caves and factory-themed levels. All populated by baddies, from evil toys to rats, as well as penguins who are the worst at throwing snowballs. The bosses themselves are alright, each having their own gimmick on how to attack them. And then of course there's the bonus stages, where all the presents you collect are dropped off to the houses from all over the world. But for some reason, despite there being many chimneys that appear on screen, you're only allowed to drop off presents to the ones with smoke coming out of them. Well, let's just hope those presents are fireproof. And that pretty much covers everything about this game. Well, at least for the Genesis version. I'll briefly talk about the Super NES version as well. Outside of the obvious differences in quality with graphics and sound, it's still the same game for the most part, but there are some noticeable differences. In this version, Santa runs a lot faster, and for some reason the camera is zoomed in more. Also, the Anti-Claus power-up lasts a lot shorter. Maybe it's because of the soundtrack being more sped up in this version, or something, I don't know. I guess you could say this version is like the hard mode, but I'm not really a fan of this version being zoomed in because most of the time I have to blindly guess where the next platform is, and I usually don't have enough time to avoid enemies that are coming by and I keep getting hit. Oh yeah, and whenever you deal damage to the final boss, there's a lot of flashing colors in this version. Yeah, not really recommended for people who deal with seizures. And that pretty much covers everything about Daze Before Christmas. And overall, it's an alright game. It's playable. It may not be as big as Final Fantasy or anything, but if you can find some way of playing it, I say it's a fine game to check out during the holiday season. But I recommend sticking to the Genesis version. Well, that takes care of this episode of Forgotten Media. So this is MeltingMan234 saying Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, and all that jazz.